On Tuesday, March 13th, 2024, I intercepted this gorgeous supercell near Alta Vista, Kansas. This storm would go on to produce an incredibly photogenic tornado during a northward occlusion, which I filmed here. Wow. There it is, tornado. But enough about that. It's this week in storm chasing, not last week in storm chasing. Let's get into it. Hi guys, I'm John Hominuk and welcome back to This Week in Storm Chasing. Today is Sunday, March 17th, 2024. I wanted to start by going over what happened last week, which obviously was a very active week for storm chasing. There were 2 or 3 days that featured notable severe weather events. Most notably was the Tuesday, March 13th event, which I just talked about in the intro. And then there was also an outbreak of tornadoes in parts of the Ohio Valley on March 14th, the day after. So this system brought 2 days of very, very active severe weather to the country. The first event was back in the plains on the 13th, and the next event after that was in the Ohio Valley. And just look at the amount of not only tornado reports, but widespread hail, including 103 significant or large hail reports. So 800 severe weather reports in total on March 14th. This event turned out to be a highly anomalous and very impactful event, which unfortunately resulted in deaths, injuries, and widespread significant damage, not only from tornadoes, but from hail and wind in parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, all the way down into Arkansas and parts of eastern Oklahoma as well. So this was a very impactful day. And again, going back to the day before that too, another really impactful event. So what caused this event, right? It's hard to really have a direct answer for that. But when we look at this weather pattern and we look at what was happening nationally during this time, it kind of makes some sense, right? We have a trough in the southwestern United States. We know that we had ample southwesterly flow ejecting out ahead of it, and we had ridging in the east. So all this leads to plentiful moisture. We have a deep elevated mixed layer, which was the lapse rates that aided in the large hail. And we had a setup for multiple days of supercells on Tuesday and Wednesday. So this trough was kind of unique. And I talked about this in last week's This Week in Storm Chasing. It drops in and cuts off, right? So here's the days after that. So the trough itself was not a trough ejection, so to speak. We had little perturbations ejecting out ahead of it, and this main trough kind of cuts off in the southwest. So a very unique setup and one that brought multiple days of chasing, but unfortunately also lots of property damage, deaths and injuries, which we never ever want to see. But there were 2 days of storm chasing involved, Tuesday and Wednesday. We did highlight both of those last week, although the areas that we highlighted were not deadly accurate, to say the least. I was highlighting the southern plains, and the events were much further north in the central plains and the Midwest and Ohio Valley. So that's last week. Where do we go from here, right? We're about to approach a much discussed lull in the severe weather pattern. If you go back and watch the videos from late February, we talked about the fact that this pattern would probably have a couple of severe chances in late February and early March, and then we were expecting things to really quiet down during the second half of March, and that's what we're heading for. So let's look at this weather pattern and sort of diagnose what's going on. So this is the remnants of our trough that brought the severe weather last week, but we have now high latitude blocking here over Greenland and a big ridge that's formed along the western shores of North America. So what's going to happen is you're going to dig a deeper trough here into the eastern U.S. underneath these blocks, and this low is going to cut off, right? So this is no good really for chasing chances. You have a deep trough in the east, and that's going to persist for several days. But the processes that are ongoing, we'll probably keep this quiet for a while because we have this retrograding ridge. And this is part of a larger scheme of things. But this ridge, I want you to watch. Initially, it's right here on the west coast of the United States. Watch where it ends up after this. It's now back over Alaska and the eastern Pacific. And beyond that, it goes even further now up into parts of northern Alaska and up into the Arctic region. So this pattern is about to get really interesting, but it's not all that great for storm chasing. And this week coming up, I really don't expect there to be much in the way of storm chasing ahead. In fact, it's going to be very quiet like we anticipated. Looking at the reasons why, again, we have this northwesterly flow down here across the northern plains, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast. This takes us through Wednesday, and then even looking beyond that, we might have some sort of interesting stuff going on across the immediate Gulf Coast later in the week, but I really don't think that this is any sort of major storm chasing opportunity. And then again, through the weekend, look at this northwesterly flow just continuing. Really nothing showing up here over the next 7 days that gets interesting in terms of storm chasing. Now, I mentioned this ridge is going to retrograde and amplify, right? It initially is here on the West Coast, then it's going to end up in Alaska, and it's going to amplify northward. That is going to lead to the development of a deep trough across the central United States, and that could get interesting this weekend, coming up into the early part of next week. I think there's too much cold air around for widespread chasing, at least as it's advertised right now. But there will be a deep low pressure system and probably a significant storm system impacting parts of the central U.S. I think a late season winter storm isn't out of the question across the northern plains. As a result, again, this big amplification, right? Watch this ridge go up here into Alaska, and you get a deep trough that develops here as a result of that. So taking us into that time frame, I think this weekend into early next week, we're probably looking at a winter storm somewhere across the northern plains states, and maybe some thunderstorms with this system, but there's still a lot in question in terms of moisture return and the amount of cold air that's around. So I think this is right now a very low probability event in terms of chasing. And if there were chasing, it would probably be across the southern plains or maybe somewhere in Dixie Alley, but really looking like a very low probability event in terms of chasing right now. So that gets us to the end of March. And that is when things are going to get interesting because, again, going back to those videos from February, we are tracking pretty much right according to schedule right now. And the schedule was active late February, a couple chasing chances into March, a quiet half of March, and then by the time we get into April, things are probably going to start to change. And that's exactly what we're starting to see on the long-range models. It might look bleak right now for chasing second half of March, but there are signs as we roll forward that things are going to change. I want to show you guys the latest MJO. This is a complicated chart, and we don't need to get into the details. I'm going to keep this high level on purpose because I don't want to, dive too much into the weeds on this. But basically, here's the MJO forecast for the next month or so, and this is coming from the European weeklies. And what we see here in the blues and greens are areas that are favorable for thunderstorm and convective development. And what we see in the reds and yellows are subsidence or suppressive patterns for convection, so less likely to get convection in these yellows and reds. What we want to see here, your dates are on the left. So here's today, and this takes us down all the way through April. And then your positioning is left to right here. So this is the different phases of the MJO. What we want to see is this propagation, right? So here's your thunderstorm activity right now. Watch it progress west to east here. That's taking us across the equatorial Pacific into phases 7, 8, 1, right? 8, 1, 2, and continues through this area into early April. And this is a big MJO circuit, a big MJO propagation. Your convection is sliding from left to right and reemerging on this side of the chart. So this is the MJO propagating through phases that we know are favorable for severe weather in the United States. And then after it gets to phases 8, 1, 2, it sort of stalls out. You see how there's no left to right movement here? It's just up and down. This is a standing wave in the Indian Ocean. That's also favorable for storm chasing, and I'm going to explain to you why. So when we get the MJO propagating like this, left to right through the Pacific, phases 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, here it goes sliding left to right, right? You can almost envision the thunderstorm activity in your head. What this does is it incites what we know as a jet extension. So here comes the Pacific jet, and you can see that Pacific jet extending out from Eastern Asia almost to the western coast of the United States. This is an extended Pacific jet stream. What this does is it takes all of this momentum and starts to build up this momentum process in the Pacific. So you have a lot of sort of built up momentum in this jet. It's extending out. Almost imagine it like a rope, right? I talk about this a lot for our clients. It's like a rope that's being extended. The Pacific jet, when it extends like this, can bring milder air and lots of moisture into the United States. And we see that's being incited by this MJO. But right around that first week of April, it stops. And when we see that Indian Ocean forcing emerge and that jet propagation stops, right? It's going left to right here, and then it just stops on a dime. That's when we get a jet retraction. And the way that we think about these jet retractions is just waves, like a rope, right? So if you're standing there holding that rope and it's really hard and extended, and then you start snapping it back and you retract it back, you get these individual waves that come out of that jet stream. And that's exactly what we're going to see with this jet stream pattern in the United States as we move forward. Another way to visualize this is by looking at this chart here. Here's your jet extension on the left. You see this long extended jet stream. You push ridging into the west coast and you have troughing in the east. When you retract that jet back and you pull it back, you get troughing in the west and that southeast ridge starts to develop. And that's the money shot for storm chasing. So why are we confident in this? Well, the reason is because the MJO sliding through these phases is now a high probability event. It's an amplified AAM and MJO, and then it's going to stall and stop quickly in the Indian Ocean forcing regime, which is already favorable for those troughs. So that's a lot of fancy wording. What does it mean? It means that we think the jet is going to extend like this through late March and early April, and then at some point it's going to snap back. And when it does, those individual waves are going to disperse into the western United States, and that will be go time for storm chasing. So when we look at the extended model data, we see exactly that. Here's our pattern right now. This is our jet extension pattern. We have the active flow into the central United States. We see this really sort of amped up pattern, that winter storm in the central U.S. in late March. But look what happens when we get into that first and second week of April. That jet pulls back. You see this ridging poking up here into the North Pacific. That's a classic storm chasing look here. And we see troughing developing in the western U.S. And this is when it's go time for storm chasing at some point in the first or second week of April as this trough develops here. So confidence is building. I want to also reference our analogs, which we had talked about quite a bit. I'm going to have to pull them up while we are on the thing here, because I think I actually accidentally closed it. Here they are. So here are our analog years that we had talked about earlier from our earlier video. This is April, May, and June. We have ridging here in central Canada, a trough underneath that in the northwest Atlantic, and then ridging in the west, and then you see your North Pacific sort of ridge building over here. I'm going to close this out and show you that that's exactly what we see here on the weeklies. We have ridging up here in central Canada, your trough in the northwest Atlantic, your North Pacific ridge, and then your trough in the west coast. So things are looking very good for what I would consider a very active April for storm chasing, and I think it could start as early as the first week of April, sometime between April 1st and 14th, as this Pacific jet snaps back and starts sending these waves out into the western United States. So it's going to be a little bit of a quiet period. I was joking around earlier saying it might be a nice time to get your camera gear organized, get your process down, and then be ready to rock and roll when we get into April, because I think we're going to kick this off into high gear here about 2 weeks from now. So we'll have an update on this week in storm chasing next week. Quiet week expected, but April is going to come in rocking and rolling based on the latest data. We'll have updates as we go through the next couple of days and weeks, and stay tuned for that Alta Vista video, which will be out in a couple days. Thanks so much for watching, guys. It's been really cool doing this series and building this, and we're going to keep it rolling throughout the year. Take care. Have a great Sunday.